Commissions of inquiry, as you well know, have revealed shocking details of how some businesses are simply flouting ethical standards. The Gordon Institute of Business Science has, however, found that companies, and wait for this, largely behave ethically. It's revealed the results of the first phase of its ethics barometer project. The project looking at, I understand, 15 leading companies and 8,000 employees. So it is a substantial study. The initial results show that companies achieved a 73% ethical fitness quotient. Joining us is Professor Nicola Klein, Dean of the Gordon Institute of Business Science. Before we get to the findings and welcome, what was the intention here? What did you set out to achieve? I understand this is a bigger initiative or part of a think tank that you set up.
We set up the Business Ethics and Governance think tank about 3 years ago, Jeremy, and what we found was that organizations quite often sit in the sort of theoretical aspect of ethics, about what would be nice, what would be good, what we think is right. And we thought we actually need to try and put some numbers to it. Now, there are always limitations on what you measure and how you measure, and it's important to stress that these organizations came voluntarily to do this survey. So we're probably measuring the more ethical of the organizations.
What did you ask them?
We adapted an instrument that was developed by professors at Harvard Business School that was administered across 23 countries. We didn't want to use a global survey because there are issues that we face here specifically around transformation and some other local issues that we really wanted to focus on. So we ended up with a long questionnaire, over 68 items around a series of 6 different areas with ethics, external stakeholder focuses, so customers, suppliers, employees, culture, misconduct, governance, how they look after that, and the engagement with broader society.
Do you think we've lost, and we'll get to what you found in just a moment, but do you think somewhere over the past couple of years we've lost sight of the importance of ethics in business? Something's gone wrong. We're off kilter here.
I think the world's off kilter. So if we look at fundamentally the accusations that have been placed at businesses' door, particularly since the 2008 crisis, the role of business, the responsibility of business, and I'm going to speak from a business perspective, I think we're in a period of profound questioning. And sometimes we think that this is only South Africa. You opened by mentioning the South African issues. Of course, we've dealt with state capture, and behind state capture are businesses. So business is culpable of unethical behavior. But that shouldn't suggest that it's only here. If we start looking globally, we're seeing aspects of transgression all the time.
I want you to look at the front page of the Financial Mail this week, if you haven't seen it already. Mogoeng, who I know spoke at your launch. We have, he says, allowed criminals and corruption practitioners to be comfortable harming South Africa. I read into that we turn a blind eye to this. And that it's difficult to get back onto the centre track.
One of the things that I think is important with ethics is this tendency to make it binary. So we'll turn around and say a company is good or bad, and that's like saying a human being is good or bad. I think they're degrees. And the problem is when you start the slide and you're not constantly interrogating not only what your employees think, and this is a limitation of the barometer, is these are employee perceptions. We haven't gone to external stakeholders, which would be a next step. It's not a question of we wake up one day and suddenly everything is bad. The question is how we're actively managing this in small ways on a day-to-day basis. So it's not, I think, large-scale criminals have taken over everything. But I think we've got to have systems where we raise red flags and we address
them. So what starts the incremental slide that you're talking about, and how then does an organisation arrest that? What are the red flags? What have you got to look out for?
Isolation at the top. So one of the critical findings in the study, and it ties in again with global norms, is what's referred to as the altitude effect. And this is where senior leaders have a very rosy view, or a relatively more rosy view, of what's going on in their organizations relative to those employees who are in the trenches. Now, why do they have that? I'm not going to suggest that all CEOs and their boards are bad. I think what happens is we become isolated from the reality, and sometimes we stop asking. So the most important thing is vigilance is not about have we got a code of conduct, have we put it in place. It's about engagement with stakeholders, and your key stakeholders
So
here are
what does the board
employees.
need to start looking for as they shine that torch into dark corners?
Well, certainly if we look at our findings, we found that there were differences in performance across various dimensions. So in terms of how employees perceive customers are being treated, fairly strong findings in excess of 80%. Where we started seeing the dark corners was actually less about misconduct, but more about issues of corporate culture, how employees are treated, victimization, bullying, fear of speaking out. And this is the climate that we have to have. You mentioned our Chief Justice Mogoeng. When he spoke this week, he made this comment about how important it is that we have freedom of expression in South Africa, that democracy has brought us freedom of expression. Our findings don't suggest that there's freedom of expression with employees and the ability to actually raise concerns. What we found is that a significant number of employees don't speak out when they see these transgressions and when they see bullying.
Which is understandable in many ways, but because jobs are scarce on the one hand, so you just want to play a protective strategy. On the other hand, organizations or leadership of the top are so obsessed with the pursuit of profit that sometimes they simply don't have time to do it. Is that they're focused on survival.
Which is dangerous when it's short run. And this is a tricky thing. We've just been speaking about SAA. And, of course, when you're sitting there saying, how are we going to pay these employee salaries, before, hopefully, the end of the month, and we're thinking about cash flow, how do we manage these things? But it's a gradual process. And the problem is that we cannot afford to have a solely shareholder-focused approach. If we can't balance the interests of stakeholders, we're going to have a problem.
The initial results, as I mentioned, show that companies achieving a 73% ethical fitness quotient. That seems like a good thing. We kind of passed. We didn't do too badly.
So we would argue that below 70 you've got a problem, but I think we're in the early phases of trying to normalize on this data. So I'm always nervous. Is 70% okay? This is like when your child comes home and says, I got 70%. Was that okay? I think what's more important is to look at relative trends. And the one key relative trend is that employees believe it's very, very important. 92% of them strongly believe that organizations need to be ethical. So what we see is a gap between what employees are saying matters and versus what their perceptions are of how organizations are performing. The important thing with ethics also is this is perceptual. The issue is that over time perceptions become reality. So the question is, well, where are the major gaps? And as I said just now, some of this is on but not perceptions actually of misconduct or suppliers or customers. It's on the treatment of employees in their organizations.
Do we need to get better at teaching ethics?
I think we need to get better at learning ethics. There have been a number of accusations post the financial crisis against business schools globally to say that business schools have failed in teaching ethics. I think we have a role to play not only in business schools but across our organizations to develop ethical muscle, ethical fitness, ethical awareness. And it starts by actually asking questions. It starts by acknowledging that there are ethical dilemmas and that we need to exercise our judgment and start thinking about possible outcomes. So can we teach people to be ethical? I would argue not alone. You can talk about what is ethics, but at the end of the day, these are tricky matters to resolve. And unless you've actually ingrained the ethical considerations into every business decision, you're not going to do as well.
Just a final one, and I want to left field you if you don't mind.
That's fine.
The death of Donnie Gordon,
yes.
Who is intimately linked with your institution. What role did he play in business in South Africa? And maybe you even want to lead it back to the barometer if you choose.
So, of course, his association with South Africa is best known with Liberty. And for us, we take our Gordon Institute of Business Science from his name. And so his initial track record of success is associated with Liberty. But, of course, he played a significant role in endowing a number of institutions, he and his family and the trust in this country, but also went off to have an incredibly successful career in property management in the United Kingdom, was eventually knighted, so Sir Donald Gordon. We obviously mourn him, but it's a time to celebrate his legacy. When he opened GIBS in 2000, he gave a speech, and he didn't give a long-winded speech. There were key principles for business success, and we were reflecting on those yesterday. We actually put them out onto social media. One of them ties in quite strongly to the ethics barometer, because he says your most precious asset is reputation. But he also spoke at that time a lot about, I think, lessons that are absolutely critical for our country to take right now, about enthusiasm, about listening to the quiet voices more carefully, about innovation, about ideas are important but execution really matters. So he's left a remarkable, remarkable legacy, and while we mourn his passing, we celebrate his life.
There was one quote I loved that was attributed to him, saying that he loved compound interest and hated weekends, which I think works really well.
I'll go for loving compound interest, but also loving weekends.
All right, Nicola Klein, thank you very much for joining us.